So are we ready to get started? John, it's glad to see you back. So this was actually a stupid mistake on my part, maybe, but Thursday and Friday I was preparing for this lesson. I was concentrating on Genesis 15. And I realized that if Don and Eric are preaching on Genesis chapter 15, and then I do Genesis chapter 15, you really don't get the whole context here. So I decided that I'm going to try and look at the life of Abraham as a whole in the account here, and then that gives context to what they're doing in the sermons, and hopefully the two fit together. But what it means is that we're going to move really, really fast this morning.
I noticed I had to go back and refer to chapter 12.
Yes, yeah. So the first question is, where does the story of Abraham begin? Where?
Chapter 11.
Oh, it went up, yes. Sorry. In the Bible. So it begins in chapter 11, and I've got a bracket around the key word there where it talks about the generations or the accounts of Terah. And as we were looking at in the earlier chapters, that where you see these references to these are the accounts of, this is the story of, these are the generations of, however your Bible translates it, this is one of the organizing principles of how the author of Genesis breaks it so that you know that we're in a new section and we need to be looking at something new here. So it starts with the account of Terah. Now, with this story here, with the account of Terah, it starts off that Terah takes Abram and his son Lot and his grandson and Sarai, the daughter-in-law, the son of Abram's wife, and they went forth from Ur of the Chaldeans. Now, when we start talking about history and the Old Testament, and we start looking at how does Genesis fit into sort of the historical record, especially historical record, this is the first place in the book of Genesis where I would say that you can actually start matching Genesis up with what we know historically. It's not to say that the rest isn't historical as far as things that happen, but when we talk about what we know historically, through the study of history and archaeology and artifacts and stuff, this is the first place where we can actually start matching things up, because we have a city, Ur of Chaldea, that we've actually dug up and excavated. So we can actually start dating things here, and we know where it is. And they set out from there to go to the land of Canaan. Now, in verse 12, you get this. Now the Lord said to Abraham, "Go from your country and your kindred and your father's house to the land that I will show you, and I will make you a great nation." Now this is the first time that we get the promise to Abraham. What's interesting here is, why did his father Terah set out before him? And I would probably speculate that Terah had some kind of relationship with God also, and this is why this whole trajectory gets started, because Abraham comes in the middle of the journey to Canaan, but the author just doesn't feel that that's important. It just mentions that Terah sets out, he takes his children, Abram being one of them. And then this, "You will be a blessing, I will bless those who bless you, and you, all the families of the earth shall be blessed." This is one of these themes that gets picked up in the New Testament, and it gets one of the things that the Jewish nation gets criticized for, that they had a very ethnocentric view of Judaism, that Yahweh was specifically interested in them. And especially you read Paul's sermons in the book of Acts, he's constantly criticizing them that they were to be a light to the Gentiles. They were to be a blessing to all the nations. We were to take this to all the peoples of the earth. And instead what happened with Judaism is they kept building more and more laws and regulations that hemmed them in and cut them off. And we won't go there, but kind of a side perspective here is this whole debate concerning when Paul talks about the works of the law and circumcision and the food purity laws. One of the big things that's come out now is there's a huge debate over what is Paul actually talking about here. Because the old view was They were trying to earn righteousness for their salvation. New perspective from going back and reading the rabbinic text says these were markers that the Jews used to set themselves off from other people. We don't eat like the Gentiles. We're circumcised. They're not. We don't do this. We don't do that. And it was a way to set themselves apart from the other people. And so, but the New Testament authors go back to this, Genesis 15, 17, and other passages to show that God's intent was for the whole world, but it was to come through this man and what he was doing there. The other thing is, when he makes these promises, is to realize how long it took these promises to be realized. Okay? So, I've got a little map here to help you understand the journey of Abraham, what takes place. And if this works right here, he starts off down here in the lower right, in Ur of the Chaldeans. Nope, it's not going to do it for me. Go back. I want to go back. Nope. Hold on one second. Gotta go back to this. Okay. Back to the map here. Starts off down here in Ur of the Chaldeans. That's where I was saying we begin to mark it. Now up there, the little red city at the very top, that's Haran. That is where Terah, his father, will die. And that's where Genesis chapter 12, where God says, go out from your people, go out from your family to the land I'm going to show you. That's where it comes. And this is why I was saying, it's halfway through the journey that we pick up with the story of Abraham. Then Abraham's going to come down through the Levant, down into Israel, and then there's going to be a famine in Israel, and we're going to go down into Egypt, and then back up into from Egypt back into the Promised Land. So when we look at these stories, you need to realize that there's a lot of geography being covered here, and there's a lot of time being covered. But hopefully this helps you see his trajectory. You got this big kind of like going over the hill and down and then back up again. Now, after they reach Israel, in chapter 12:10 it says, now there was a severe famine in the land, so Abraham went down to Egypt and sojourned there for the famine. And we all know the story that when they go down to Egypt, Pharaoh sees Sarai and thinks she's attractive, and he's going to bring her into his sort of harem there, this royal court that he's going to have. And what does Abraham, our hero, say to do in this whole situation? He tells Sarah, tell him that you're my sister. Okay? This is the guy who is the father of faith, who Genesis chapter 15 is going to say, believed God and was reckoned to him as righteousness. But he tells Sarah to tell Pharaoh that you're my sister. And then Pharaoh is even going to come up to him and say, after he finds out this whole thing, he's going to come up and he's going to say, what have you done to me? You know, and in the story there, Pharaoh comes across more righteous and is a better person than Abraham does. It's this very, very interesting thing. And also at the very end of it, where he says, take her and go, the constructions of the verbs there are very, very similar to what God tells Abraham at the start of chapter 12, when he's up there in Haran where his father died, where he says, get up and go to the land I'm going to show you. So Pharaoh comes across almost speaking like God does in this chapter. They come back into the land. Chapter 13, they settle in the hill country of Israel a little bit further north of modern-day Jerusalem. And it's at this point that we get several markers here that help us understand something about Abraham. First off, Abram's name, Abram, means father of a great one or exalted father. And this was probably a name that was given in reference to Terah, his father. That Terah was seen as the great one or the exalted one. The second thing that we have here is that when they arrive up there in the hill country, that the land isn't big enough to support both Abram and Lot's families. Now, I don't know about you guys, but if there's not enough land for your people to live on, it gives you a clue that there's a lot of people involved here. We always read these stories as it's just Abram and maybe his wife and a couple servants and maybe Lot and his kids. But told within the context of the story, we'll see a couple other markers here that come across, is that Terah was probably the equivalent of one of these Afghani warlords or princes, that he controlled a region of well, I don't want to say Afghanistan. I was using that as an analogy. But he controlled a region of like the Ur of the Chaldees. So when he sets out, this is like a prince with his tribe going forth with him. And probably why Terah was then recognized as the exalted father or the great father, somewhere along these lines. But you see this with this, that there's not enough property there, and so they have to say, Lot says, well, I'll go down, I'll take the Jordan Valley, and Abram will stay up here. Now this then presents one of these really interesting quandaries in the story, because here Abram is this great tribal leader, but he has no heir. And the whole promise is about the heir, and God's going to make him a great nation. But in the middle of this, he's a very great and powerful man to start with. So the author is playing with all sorts of things in the story here for you to wrestle with. You know the whole story that they separate, he goes down. Now in chapter 13 here, God comes to Abraham and he says to him, after he separates, he says, lift up your eyes and look from the place where you are, northward and southward, eastward and westward. I will give you all the land that you see. I will give it to you and your offspring forever. I will make your offspring as the dust of the earth. So if one can count the dust of the earth, your offspring can also be counted. Now, a couple points here. Number one, you get the second promise that's being given. You know, look how great. And this is one of these things in the story is over and over and over and over, God makes these promises to Abraham. It's not just once. It's very, very repetitive. Second thing is dust of the earth. Chapter 15, we're going to see the opposite analogy, count the stars in the heaven. And it's one of these things that's impossible to do. I mean, could you imagine going out, especially in Colorado without all the rain? I was just riding my mountain bike over in Palmer Park, and the whole thing, I mean, usually you're afraid of the rocks over there, you know, don't fall and hit the rocks. Now you come screaming down a turn, and it's like, oh no, sand. And if you've ever ridden a mountain bike and you hit deep sand, you know what I'm talking about. You just have no control at all. It's kind of like skiing with, you know, those Telmark binder things, you know. So he says, count the dust of the earth. And then later on, it's going to be counting the stars. It's a job that just can't be done. Third thing is offspring. This goes right back to Genesis 3, where he talks to Eve that your offspring or your seed will be the one that crushes the serpent's head, but he shall bruise your own heel. And so this whole theme of the seed is coming through once again here in this story, and it hasn't been realized yet. So they're still moving forward with that. We then move to the end of chapter 14, and at the end of chapter 14, you've had a marauding king come in from sort of like modern-day Damascus up in that region. They've come down, and this is a powerful king. They've overwhelmed Gomorrah. They've overwhelmed Lot. I mean, Sodom. They've overrun all the other surrounding towns and villages and taken the people off as slaves and captives. Now, I was saying this is one of these markers that really lets you know how great Abram is that Abram takes his men, and we're told here that he has 318 men that can fight. Okay, so you add women to that, you add children to that. He's probably got a clan of 2,000 to 3,000 people, servants and stuff like that are traveling with him. And he's able to mount this and then go out and defeat this foreign king that's invaded the land and then rescue the people and bring them back. We move on from here into chapter 15. Now, at the start of chapter 15, after these things, the word of the Lord came to Abram in a vision. Fear not, Abram, I am your shield. Now, that reference to I am your shield probably directly goes back to chapter 14, this battle to rescue Lot. So in the context there, Abram's gone out and done something great. He's probably feeling pretty good, like, hey, you know, everybody around here, I am the tough dude. And then God comes along and says, I am your shield. I'm the one who does war. And your reward will be great. Then he tells him, Abraham says, O Lord, what will you give me for I continue childless, and the heir of my house is Eliezer of Damascus? In other words, someone in his clan or tribe that's traveling with him is going to inherit everything he has. And Abraham goes to the central question here is, what are you going to give me? How am I going to know that these three promises you've given me so far of an heir making me like the dust of the earth, that I'm going to be this great nation, that these promises are going to, I'm going to bless all the nations of the world. How am I going to know these things are going to come about? Because I am still childless. And so he asks the question, and then God says, look towards heaven, number the stars if you're able to number them. So shall your offspring be. So I said before, count the dust. Now it's count the stars. And this is what your offspring will be like. What's interesting is in the middle of this promise, God says to Abraham, know for certain that your offspring will be sojourners in a land that is not theirs, and will be servants there. And they will be afflicted for 400 years. But I will bring judgment on any nation, on the nation that they serve, and afterward they shall come out with great possessions. As for you, you shall go to your fathers in peace. You shall be buried in a good old age. Now, this is really amazing because God has promised to make him this great nation, to make him have all these children and stuff like this. But when's this going to take place? Okay. 400 years later, and 400 years of what? Slavery. We always think that God's promises are for us here and now. We get frustrated when things don't happen here and now for us. But here God's making all these promises to Abraham, and then right in the middle of all the promises he says, oh, by the way, it's going to take 400 years, and your offspring are going to be slaves for 400 years. And it really lets us see right at the very start that a lot of times when we look at the Bible and our relationship with God, we think it's about us. How is God going to bless me? How is God going to make me better? How is God going to help me resolve family or work or all these different issues or health problems or stuff like that? And it's not about us. It's about God. And God tells Abraham, the father of the Jewish nation, it's going to take 400 years, and it's going to be 400 years of slavery. And you kind of go, oh, gee, thanks. This is a great promise. And in fact, Abraham, you're not even going to really see it. You're going to die in old age. You're going to live to be a great old age, but you're going to die. But it's going to take 400 years for these things to take place. Okay, so how does Abraham take this? Well, him and Sarah then come up. Sarah, Abraham's wife, had borne him no children. She had a female Egyptian servant whose name was Hagar. Sarai said to Abraham, behold, now the Lord has prevented me from bearing children. Go into my servant, and it may be that I shall obtain children by her. And Abram listened to the voice of Sarai. Now here's a guy who's just gone out and whooped an invading king's army. But him and Sarai come up with plan B as to how they're going to fulfill the promises of God. And then it goes in, it says, but Abraham said to Sarai, what happens here is Sarai gets pregnant. She's been elevated from slave to sort of mistress or concubine. Yeah. It's the same person. The name's got changed later on, you know. Sorry. So Sarai gives Hagar to Abram. And in the culture of that day, Hagar is now elevated. She's not quite a wife, but she's above a slave. She's like part of the household one of the women there. And Hagar now is kind of looking down at Sarah because she's been elevated, but she's also pregnant. And so Sarai doesn't like this. So we see the second injustice that's going to be going on here, is that now she comes up to him and she says, behold, your servant, she comes up and she complains to Abram. And Abraham says, behold, your servant is in your power. Do to you as are pleased. And then Sarai dealt harshly with her, and then Hagar fled from her. You can just kind of see, she says, here, you're going to be his wife. He's going to have sex with you. You get no say in this. And the second thing is, once she has that status and she's no longer in slavery, Sarah complains about it. And so Abraham hands her back as a slave to Sarai. And then it says, Sarai dealt harshly with you. Now, I don't know about you, but how harshly does a person have to be dealt with that when they're pregnant, they will run off into the wilderness by themselves? Okay? This is probably pretty extreme treatment that's being brought across. And so what's interesting is, just like we looked at the story of Noah, how at the very end of the story with our great hero, he's drunk and doing something wrong, and he falls kind of from grace. With Sarah and Abraham, these people are questionable through the whole thing. But yet God still works with them. That's the amazing thing about it. And so Hagar flees off. In fact, the one person who kind of comes across in the story pretty well is Hagar, which is rather interesting. Then we have the Lord finding Hagar by the spring. And what's interesting, we often skip over this. The angel says, return to your master and go back. But then the angel of the Lord says to her, I will surely multiply your offspring so that they cannot be numbered for multitude. Behold, you are pregnant, you shall bear a son, you shall call his name Ishmael, because the Lord has listened to your affliction. And Ishmael means God hears. And so, even though we look at the promises to Isaac, Ishmael also gets promises here in this whole thing. So even though Sarah and Abraham are not treating Hagar very well, that's not the way God operates. Chapter 17. When Abraham was 99 years old, the Lord appeared to him again. And he says, I am the God Almighty. Walk before me and be blameless, that I may make a covenant between me and you and multiply you greatly. Now, in chapter 15, we have one covenant. Abraham says, how shall these things be? God says, look at the stars of the heaven. And then you get this whole thing of cutting the animals in half. And then in kind of this dream or darkness, Abraham sees kind of an interesting vision of God passing through the midst of it. Here in chapter 17, we have a second covenant being made, but this time it's the covenant of circumcision. So now, the first one was between God to man. Now the second one is man to God with the covenant of circumcision. And the naming here, no longer shall your name be called Abram, which means exalted father or great father. Now it's going to be Abraham, for I have made you a father of a multitude of nations. Now, Abraham there rhymes with Abrahamam, which means a father of a multitude. So even though Abraham really kind of doesn't mean anything, you look it up in the Jewish Hebrew lexicons, and they're kind of like, well, it's kind of related to this. And what it is, it's a rhyme with Abramam. That means a father of a multitude. So there's probably a play on the sound there that's going into the meaning here. The second thing that goes on here, we get Abraham being renamed, and then he says, as for your wife Sarai, which is one of these names that you kind of go, okay, really not a good Hebrew name. We're not sure what it exactly means. But when you change the end of it to Sarah, it means queen or princess. Okay? Now here's the irony of the whole story. Okay? Abraham, who's going to be the father of a multitude, he has no kids yet. And then Sarah, who's called queen or princess because kings are going to come from her, she has nothing. So you can imagine the next day when Abram comes out and tells his tribe you're going to call me Abraham from now on, and she is princess. They must have gone, good grief, what is going on with this guy? Because the names don't match the reality at all. And it's kind of, it's like the first Trumpism. It's kind of like this really, puffing things up here that go on. Then in chapter 18, we get the promise again. We get the Lord appearing to him at the oaks of Mamre, and you know the story of the three men approaching Abraham and having the discussion about what's going on. And you're going to have a child this time next year. And Sarah laughs. And the angel says, why are you laughing? I didn't laugh. No, I heard you laughing. You're going, she just can't believe that after all these years and all these promises and then going with plan B and finding that plan B doesn't work, so we're back to plan A again, that this thing and the changing the names and the circumcision and all this, still no kid, but now the angel says you're going to have a kid. Now in the middle of this, Sarah's going to conceive, but then the second thing that we have here is as the child grows up, and you actually have the son Isaac, what takes place here is in the second line it says, Sarah saw the son of Hagar, the Egyptian, whom she had borne to Abram, laughing. And that's probably one of these euphemisms, once again, kind of like Sarah mistreating her. There was probably some joking or jesting or something going on here, or him trying to usurp Isaac or something going on. Remember, he's 13 years older than Isaac at this point in time. And so something's going on here that the Bible just puts down to laughing in this translation. And so Sarah comes up again. First she gives him Hagar to her husband. Then she takes him back as a slave. Then she mistreats her so that she drives her away. This time it's intentional. She says, cast out this slave woman with her son, for the son of the slave woman shall not be the heir with my son Isaac. And that probably gives you a hint as to what's going on there with the laughing. And it says this thing was very displeasing to Abraham on account of his son. And you just really see the harshness of this story, that they're going to drive Hagar and this young boy out, with really no resources into a hostile world at that time. Now, the thing that's interesting about this whole story here that goes on, and how much time we got? 45. And why isn't that popping up? There we go. Well, that went fast. Is that when Hagar goes out into the wilderness, she is rescued by the angel, and we have another promise to Ishmael that he's going to become a great nation. The other thing that takes place in this promising here is that the rabbinic scholars, as they interpreted this story, they just thought, how can Abraham, the father of Israel, be such a hard, ruthless person that he would cast out Hagar and his own son into the wilderness? And so what happens, they begin to tell stories. In other words, they're filling in the gaps. It's kind of like the Christmas story. About half the Christmas story, the way we celebrate it, with like 3 kings and the donkey and the ox and all this sort of stuff, it's not in the Bible. It's from the Proto-Evangelium of Matthew, which fills in gaps about the birth of Jesus. So the rabbis fill in gaps here, and they tell us that Abraham would go out and visit Hagar and Sarah to make sure that they were okay, bring them food, make sure they're protected. And by around 400 AD, it's evolved into a kind of a complicated story where Abraham would get permission from Sarah first, because we kind of know that's the kind of where his relationship is at. And he promises that when I go out, I will visit her, but I will visit them, but I won't get down off my camel. Okay? Obviously, no hanky-panky will take place. The first time he visits them, Hagar and Ishmael are not there, but Ishmael's son is. And so he then asks Ishmael's wife for some food. She says, there is no food. So he says, well, tell Ishmael when he comes back that the threshold to his door isn't right. and he leaves. So she tells Ishmael when he comes back what Abram had said, but she didn't know who he was. Ishmael realizes that this is a code that my wife is not very good, and so he divorces her. Then the second time, 3 years later, Abraham comes to visit, and he has a new wife, visits her, same thing, Hagar and Ishmael are out gathering food. He says, can I have something to eat and drink? I'm thirsty. So she gives him food, so Abraham prays for her and their household, and then he leaves. Ishmael comes back, she tells him the story, and he realizes, she's a good wife. Now, what's very interesting around this is that these stories are written down around 300 to 400 A.D. Around 500 A.D., we have a guy named Muhammad who comes on the scene. And in the Quran, we have the story of Ishmael, because he's the rightful heir, not Isaac. What's very interesting is he picks up these two rabbinic stories, incorporates them into the Quran, and then adds a third one, that the third time Abram visits Ishmael and Hagar, they're there, and Abraham says, we need to do something, and we need to build a site to worship God. And Ishmael and Abram build the Kaaba. So they're actually down in Mecca at this point in time. So you actually see this Jewish tradition then off the story trying to rectify and make Abraham look better, then getting picked up and incorporated into the Quran. Nope. One move. One last thing. One last story that I want to hit. At the very end of this, you get the testing, the binding of Isaac on the altar, and we're going to worship Isaac. We're going to offer up Isaac. This is very interesting. This comes at the very end after 5 promises to Abraham about this heir, and then at the very end of it, you're going to sacrifice this one. And so it's this very interesting story of a testing here. But what I want to do is just move on. 25:12. This is the account of Abraham's son Ishmael. And so that this is the account, or these are the generations of. Immediately we know here we have the Hebrew word Gedolith. Means this is the end of the story of Abraham. So it kind of brackets it. Now if we look at the whole thing in a big thing here, what you get is, I just want to kind of show you some of the balance and the artistry that the Hebrew artists incorporate into the story. So they're not just relating the story. These are told in a very artistic way. And it's not just to make the story pretty, but it's also to make it so that a person could memorize it and orally recite it. So I've showed you how to do like a narrative plot. You can lay it out on a narrative plot. But this is another way you can look at it, is that at the very beginning and the end, so the 2 A's, A up top, A prime at the bottom, you get the generations of Terah, and then you get Ishmael's generations. And then B and B prime, what we miss in English is in B, the Lech Lecha, this is the Hebrew, go forth from your people. And then in the story of Isaac, the binding of Isaac, the Adeka, bind him. And so in Hebrew, there's a rhyming there between the two that's taking place. And you have all these commands. Get up and go forth to the place of God show you. Get up, take your son, and go to the mountain. I will show you. There's all these parallels between the two stories. C, to your seed I will give this land. C prime, the birth of Isaac, the seed. And it moves all the way through here, but it really helps you to see, A, how God has been working with Abraham over such an extended period of time. B, that even though from Abraham and Sarah's perspective things are just not working out, or from all the tribal members that are there, good grief, you want me to call you a multitude, a father of a multitude? You don't even have your own kid yet. And we're going to call Sarah princess now? This is just ridiculous from a human point of view, but God's working. And then even from Abram's point of view, who's getting the whole thing, yeah, I'm going to give you this seed. I'm going to make you a multitude. I'm going to do all these. I'm going to bless you. You're going to have more children than the stars of heaven. Oh, yeah, I forgot to mention something. you're not going to see this take place for another 400 years. And those 400 years, your people are going to be slaves. And it really puts it within a perspective that oftentimes we think it's about us, but in reality it's about what God is doing and what God wants to do. And it really helps, once again, go back to Genesis chapter 1, 2, and 3 with Eve. Your offspring shall bruise the serpent's head, and he shall strike them in the heel. These promises are yet to work out, and they're going to take a very, very long time. And so when we get frustrated with how quickly God's working, we need to really realize that his time and our time, his plans and our plans are often very, very different from each other. I will close there because, once again, I knew I was going to go long today. Once again, we need to get ready for the 11 o'clock service. But as normal, if anyone wants to talk more or discuss this, I'll be over there. I have to refill my coffee and make sure I'm ready for the rest of the day. So thank you very much.